Hello and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to officially learn 2 of the 5 forms of the biblical Hebrew verb. What are the 5 forms? Here they are. First, a verbal adjective called the participle. This is the form that describes a person who's doing the activity, who's saying, speaking, making, creating, all the possible things that one might be doing. Because it's an adjective, a verbal adjective, it can appear in 4 different possible ways: masculine, feminine, singular, and plural. Second, the imperative form. Sit, stay, run, jump. Every verb has imperative forms. Third, a verbal noun describing the activity of the verb. It's used in 2 different ways. One, like the English gerund, swimming is fun. And the other, like the English infinitive, I like to swim. One form does both of those jobs in Hebrew. And because it's not limited to who or when, it's not finite, therefore, as in English, it's called the infinitive. And finally, 2 forms that do tell you who did something and when it was done. Because these forms pin down the time when an action occurred, they're called finite verbs. And they are the forms we've already seen many times in the Bible: the perfect and the imperfect. And those are the 5 forms of the verb: participle, imperative, infinitive, perfect, and imperfect. Today, the perfect and the imperfect. We've seen both these forms in the text we've already read together. Let's have a look. First, some examples of the perfect. Bara, he created, in Genesis 1:1. Kara, he called, in Genesis 1:5. Both of these are 3rd masculine singular. And haita, it was, in Genesis 1:2, 3rd feminine singular. Yes, these forms, the perfect and the imperfect, both have person, gender, and number. In the first person, a singular and plural, used for both genders in common. In the second and third persons, masculine and feminine forms, singular and plural forms, just as there are for pronouns. Let's learn all the forms of the perfect right now. The way person, gender, and number are marked in the perfect verb is by changing the endings on the verb. And the unmarked form, the form without an ending, is 3rd masculine singular. That's the form you'll find in the dictionary. We'll use the verb shamar, which means keep or guard. And for convenience, we'll translate all these perfect forms as past tenses. In post-biblical Hebrew, this form is always the past tense. In biblical Hebrew, it's a little more complicated, but we'll save that part for later. Here we go. Let's compare these forms with their matching pronouns so you can see how the endings correspond. They're not exactly the same, but they're not random. So if you know your pronouns, as you all promised me you would by now, the endings that correspond should not be hard to learn. Let's read them together. Ani shamarti, I kept or guarded. Ata shamarta, you kept, masculine singular, talking to one male person. At shamart, you kept, speaking to one female person. In brackets, because this form of this verb doesn't actually occur in the Bible. It does occur with other verbs, and this is what it would look like with our verb. Hu shamar, he kept. Again, this is the form you'll find in the dictionary. He shamira, she kept. That a ending doesn't really match the pronoun, but it is the commonest way to mark feminine singular. If you remember tov, tova, you won't have any trouble with shamar, shamra. In my accent, you're liable to hear me pronounce it as 2 syllables, sham-ra. That's the modern pronunciation. But in terms of biblical Hebrew, that's a little sloppy. That shva under the mem is a vocal shva. It's replacing the a of shamar the way the apostrophe of the English word isn't replaces the o of is not. And I'm telling you this because there are cases where the ending is added, but the vowel is not replaced. Instead of shamara, it's shamara. It's the ending that matters, that tells you who's doing the verb. Now the plurals. Anachnu shamarnu, we kept. In the first person, there's just one form. Gender doesn't matter. Atem shmartem, you kept, speaking to a group, as long as they're not all female. And if they are, aten shimarten, you kept, speaking to an all-female group. Again, in this particular verb, the second person feminine forms don't actually occur in the Bible, but they do with other roots. And finally, the third common plural, hem shamaru, they kept. We think there used to be a separate form for the third feminine plural, and there may still be a couple of them in the text, but you should learn this form with the u ending as the third common plural for both genders. You'll sometimes find that the vowel is not shortened and the accent doesn't shift. Shamaru is the ending that matters. U, third common plural. Shamaru, they kept. Let's say them together. Shamarti, shamarta, shamart, shamar, shamra. And the plurals, shamarnu, shmartem, shmarten, shamru. Notice that tem and ten are heavy endings. The accent follows them to the end of the word, and the first vowel contracts. Shamarti, but shmartem. One more time. Shamarti, shamarta, shamart, shamar, shamara, shamarnu, shmartem, shmarten, shamaru. And now you. And the plurals. All right, that is the perfect of the Hebrew verb. When you see a perfect verb, from this moment on, he said hopefully, you need to be able to identify, one, the root of the verb, and two, the PGN of the verb, the person, gender, and number of the ending. The root can sometimes be tricky. The PGN never needs to be, as long as you learn them solidly, as absolutely quickly as you can, same way you did with the pronouns. There are plenty of things to think about in Biblical Hebrew. Let your spinal cord handle these endings, so you can use your brain for more difficult things. Now, the opposite of the perfect, the imperfect. The perfect is always marked by endings. The imperfect is always marked by prefix letters. But because there are only 4 prefix letters, a few endings are added to distinguish between them. Here are the prefix letters. Aleph, I, first person common, singular. Nun, we, first person common, plural. Taf, you, all of the second person forms begin with taf. Yud, he and they, third person masculine forms. Taf again, she and they, third person feminine forms. These 4 letters, Aleph, Yud, Taf, and Nun, spell the Hebrew word Eitan, which means strong. It's our name, Ethan. So when you hear me mention the Eitan letters, you'll know that I mean these 4 letters that are used for the prefixes of the imperfect verb form. All right, let's look at the complete paradigm of the imperfect. Ani eshmor, I will keep. Notice that all the other forms have the vowel E not under the prefix letter. Why is this one different? Alephs love segols. They love that sound. Ani eshmor. Ata tishmor. You will keep, masculine singular. At tishmiri. You will keep, feminine singular. Taf for the second person, but marked as feminine by adding that E vowel to the end. And they will sometimes add the ending, but not use that apostrophe sound, the shva, and just leave the accent where it is, tishmori. Same meaning, just not using the contraction. Hu yishmor, he will keep. He tishmor, she will keep. Yes, the third feminine singular and second masculine singular are identical. The plurals. Anachnu nishmor, we will keep. Atem tishmeru, you, masculine or mixed plural, will keep. As always, when they add these vowel endings, you might find that they don't use the contraction, don't move the accent, and just say tishmoru. Atena tishmorna, you, all female group, will keep. In the imperfect, the third person plural does have separate forms for masculine and feminine. Hem yishmeru, they will keep, and hena tishmorna. Second and third person feminine plurals are the same. Let's say them together. Eshmor, tishmor, tishmeri, yishmor, tishmor again, nishmor, tishmeru, tishmorna, yishmeru, tishmorna again. One more time. Eshmor, tishmor, tishmeri, yishmor, tishmor, nishmor, tishmeru, tishmorna, yishmeru, tishmorna. Now you. And the plurals. Again, some of these feminine forms don't actually occur with this particular root, but they do occur with other roots. One interesting thing to notice is that none of these forms are unmarked. In the perfect, the unmarked form, the one without any endings at all, the dictionary form of the verb, is used for the third masculine singular. But in the imperfect, all of the forms have a prefix that marks them for person, gender, and number. The third masculine singular is marked just like all the others. It's got a yud prefix to tell you that it's third masculine singular. That's because the unmarked form that gives rise to the imperfect is the infinitive. We're going to learn it another time, but shmor, no prefix, is how you describe keeping something without specifying who or when. Our English gerund. And our English kind of infinitive, to keep, is li shmor. The preposition le, to, just like in English, and then this infinitive form, shmor. Much more on that in a future lesson. We have a few more things to talk about in the rest of this lesson that are a little bit complicated. First of all, why are these forms called perfect and imperfect? What does that mean? If bara means he created, if shamar means he kept or he guarded, if amar means he said, why can't I just call this the past? Answer, because it's not quite. Past and future are tenses. Perfect and imperfect are aspects. They relate not just to when the verb happened, but to how. A perfect verb tells you that this action happened once and it's over. When 2 Samuel 5:4 tells us, David was 30 when he began to reign, ben shloshim shana David b'molcho, arba'im shana malach, and he reigned for 40 years. Arba'im shana malach. Malach is the third masculine singular perfect of mem lamed kaf, to rule as a melech, to reign. He reigned. Now, 40 years is a long time, but the verb is relating to David's kingship as something that he did once for a single 40-year period in the past, and now it's over. That one-time action is described as complete, perfect. That's what a perfect verb does. Now, Exodus 15:18. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, forever and ever. What's going to happen forever and ever? Adonai, the Lord, yimloch, will reign. As yet, that action is still imperfect. It ain't over till it's over, and it ain't going to be over. It is not a completed action because it's going to go on forever into the future. But the imperfect verb does not have to refer to the future. Let's have a look at Proverbs 8:15. Wisdom personified is speaking. Bi melachim yimlochu. Be me, in me, or with me, or through me, says wisdom, chokhmah. Melachim yimlochu. Kings rule. Not they will rule, they do rule. Kings rule by using wisdom, a present tense in English. That's still an imperfect activity. The imperfect can refer to the future or the present as long as the action isn't complete. And it can even refer to the past as long as you're describing an action that is not a one-time activity. For example, whenever Job's children were partying together, afterward, Job would offer sacrifices to God. Kacha ya'aseh Iyov kol hayamim. Thus, kacha ya'aseh Iyov, Job would do kol hayamim, all the days. This is something that happened in the past, but it's something that he did over and over again. Not something he did once, something he habitually used to do. That's also expressed by using an imperfect verb. At some point, Job stopped doing that, but it doesn't matter. If what you're focusing on is that it happened over and over, you use an imperfect verb. That's what happens in Exodus 19:19, the single day in history, according to that story, on which the Israelites directly experienced revelation at Mount Sinai. Moses would speak, yedaber, and God would answer him, ya'anenu, in a clap of thunder, be-kol, kol with a kuf, meaning a voice or a sound, and especially the sound of thunder, a thunderclap. This was a one-time event, but something happened over and over during that event is still in the imperfect. To sum up, the imperfect can mean 1, the future, 2, the generalized present, something that always happens, 3, an action that is habitual or repeated, something that will happen, is happening, or did happen over and over again. And fourth, the imperfect is used not only for what will happen, but for what might happen. But we're going to save that for another time. Right now, let's go back to Job 1:5 and look at that verb ya'aseh for a moment. Thus Job would do all the days. Kacha ya'aseh Iyov kol hayamim. I gave you a paradigm of the imperfect verb using the root shin mem resh, to keep or to guard. So if Job used to do this verb, our verse would have said, Kacha yishmor Iyov kol hayamim. Shouldn't I just be able to replace shin mem resh with ayin sin hey and keep my same vowels? Why don't those two forms chime? The answer, as we discussed last time, is that some letters misbehave, or at least they behave differently. The thing to remember is that as long as they behave consistently, we can deal with them. Once you internalize what those letters do, you'll always know what's going on. So when I look at ya'aseh, I immediately see two things. The first letter of the root is ayin, a guttural. The last letter of the root is hey. The ayin, one doesn't want a simple shva underneath it, like the shin has of yishmor, so there's a compound shva there. Two, ayin wants the vowel to be a patach, an a vowel, whenever it can be. So that's the kind of compound shva we have. And three, the vowel before a compound shva is always going to be a full vowel that matches the half vowel of the compound shva. Sometimes the very first vowel of a word is a compound shva, but if there's another vowel before it, those vowels are going to match. The hey, when it's the third radical, is almost always going to have an e vowel before it. When you do see that e, segol hey, it's a sure sign that the last root letter is hey. So even though ya'aseh and yishmor sound completely different, it's obvious that they are the same form. Maybe I should put obvious in quotation marks, like the physicist when you ask him, is it really obvious? And he spends an hour filling up the blackboard with equations, and then he says, see, I told you it was obvious. But the point is that once you learn it, it really is obvious. I know it takes a while to absorb this stuff, but once you do, there's no guessing involved. Save the guessing for more profound subjects. The point is, learn what the different patterns mean and learn how to see through superficial differences to recognize the same essential pattern. We're going to focus in on these different patterns in lessons of their own, but you can start getting familiar with them as we encounter them. Now, to get back to our bigger topic today, the perfect and the imperfect, we've learned the forms, and we'll review them, but I want to remind you of something we saw in Genesis 1:5a. Vayikra Elohim laor yom, velachoshech kara laila. Remember? God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Kara, third masculine singular perfect, he called. Yikra, third masculine singular imperfect, he will call, he should call, he used to call. But va yikra, vav plus patach plus dagesh in the next letter, also means the past tense, and he called. That va converts the imperfect form into having a perfect meaning. What's the difference between the past tense expressed by the perfect and the past tense expressed by the converted imperfect? It's subtle, but very important. The perfect is just a plain old past tense, whatever kind of past tense is called for in the circumstances. He called, he had called, he did call. But the converted imperfect is a special kind of past tense. It's the imperfect consecutive. Vayikra says not only that God called the light day, but that was the next thing he did after whatever we just finished talking about. It's converted because it's an imperfect form that's converted to refer to a completed action. It's consecutive because it tells you the order of events. By using a perfect verb in the second phrase, the verse is letting us know that he didn't call them day and night in that order. He gave them those names simultaneously. That's why the object and the verb are switched to get the verb away from the vav. Another converted imperfect, another vayikra, would have been describing a sequence of events, and these two events did not happen in sequence. But they couldn't just say v'kara, because there's such a thing as a converted perfect too. Kara, he called. Yikra, he will call. Va yikra, and then he called. V'kara, and then he will call. There's a converted perfect on day 4 of creation, so let's go there right now. You remember that in Genesis 1:14, God said, "Let there be lights, yehi me'orot." And why? Lehavdil bein yom uvein laila, to separate between day and night. And what did he say then? Vehayu leotot ulemoadim uleyamim veshanim. And then, after they are separated, they will be for signs and for set times and for days and years. Hayu, with that third common plural perfect ending, they were. V'hayu, and they will be. Verse 15 goes on to say, V'hayu lime'orot birkia hashamayim, leha'ir al ha'aretz. V'hayu, again, after they are separated, they will be, lime'orot, for lights, birkia hashamayim, in the firmament of the sky, leha'ir, to shine light, or al ha'aretz, upon the earth. Vayehi chen, and it was, vayehi, so. And it was so, vayehi chen. Vayehi, and it was, is a converted imperfect. Third masculine singular, prefix yud. Vehayu, and they will be, is converted perfect. U, marking the third common plural of the perfect. Hayu, they were. V'hayu, and they will be. Haya is the verb to be in Hebrew. But remember that final hey, when it's standing in for yud as a root letter, likes to drop off and disappear, the same way the hey did in the adjective beautiful, yafim and yafot. So when you add that u ending, you don't add it to haya, you drop off the ah first. Not hayahu like shamaru, but hayu. Third common plural perfect, they were. V'hayu, converted perfect, and they will be. This might be a good place to do two more things. One, to remind you that the only two forms Hebrew has that tell you when someone did something are these two, the perfect and the imperfect. There's no specific present tense verb form in biblical Hebrew. If you want to say, he rides his bike to work every morning, you use an imperfect verb because that's a repeated action. But if you want to talk about something specific that's going on right now, look, he's riding a bike. You have to use the participle, which we'll learn another time, because that's the form that describes a person doing an action. He is riding. It doesn't describe the time when the action happens. How do you do that? In English, we do it by using the verb to be. He is riding a bike, or he was riding, he will be riding a bike. So here comes the second thing I wanted to mention now. In Hebrew, the verb to be, haya, he was, doesn't have a present tense. It still doesn't in modern Hebrew. That's him in Hebrew is zehu, literally, this he, zehu. Hebrew speakers and Hebrew readers mentally make the equivalence without a form of the verb to be. The beginning of the book of Kings. V'hamelech David zaken. And the king David zaken, old. In Bible translations, we say, and King David was old, because and King David old sounds idiotic in English. But that kind of sentence is called a nominal sentence, that is a noun sentence, a sentence without a finite verb. That kind of sentence is perfectly normal in Hebrew. And King David was old, v'had melech David zaken. In some English Bibles, you'll see that word was in italics to indicate that there's no actual word in the Hebrew that's being translated that way. But it's normal Hebrew not to use it. And now, a warning. We said that English, like the vast majority of languages, is a subject-verb-object language, SVO. Dave drove the car. Dave, the subject, drove the verb, the car, object of the verb, what Dave drove. But in the narrative parts of the Bible, it's more common to see VSO syntax, verb, subject, object. God said, Vayomer Elohim. When we translate Vayomer Elohim into English, we not only translate the words, we move them around to use English syntax instead of Hebrew syntax. Here's the warning. Vayomer is a converted imperfect verb, and it's a third masculine singular verb. The root of the verb is aleph mem resh. The yud tells us that a noun that's masculine singular, and not you or me, but a third person, is doing it. That is, the pronoun is built into the verb. It's the form you use when a he or an it does something. The subject is built into the verb vayomer, and he said. Example from Exodus 32:17. Vayomer, and he said, El Moshe, to Moses. We know who said it because his name has already been mentioned. The verse begins, Vayishma Yehoshua, and Joshua heard, et kol ha'am. Et, definite direct object marker. Kol with a kuf, a sound or a voice. Kol ha'am, the sound of the people, the nation. They were down there building a golden calf. Vayomer el Moshe, and he said to Moses, look out below, we're in big trouble. Vayomer, and he said. But in Vayomer Elohim, if you start out by translating And he said, you're also in big trouble because there's a subject there, Elohim. If you mentally translate Vayomer or Vayishmor or Vatishma or Vata'as or Vayar or any such verb with the pronoun automatically, what are you going to do when the subject shows up? Always remember that the subject may follow the verb, and don't fill in a subject pronoun until you need to. Vayomer el Moshe, and he said to Moses, but Vayomer Moshe, and Moses said. All right, let's review the forms one last time, and I'll use the pronouns just to help reinforce the connection between them and the verbs for you. First, the perfect, ani shamarti, ata shamarta, at shamart, hu shamar, he shamra. And the plurals, anachnu shamarnu, atem shmartem, atena shamarten, hem and hena shamaru. Now the imperfect, ani eshmor, ata tishmor, at tishmeri, hu yishmor, he tishmor. And the plurals, anachnu nishmor, atem tishmeru, atena tishmorna, hem yishmeru, hena tishmorna. And here is your challenge for Numbers 22. Find 5 perfect verbs that are third masculine singular. Find 5 converted imperfect verbs that are third masculine singular. And find 5 converted imperfect verbs that are third feminine singular. To do that, you're going to have to be able to recognize what's a verb. If you want to use an English translation to help you do that, be my guest. See you next time.